most of you know me, you're in my class, a few walk-ins, which we're glad to have you here. I'm Mark Crane, Chairman of the Policy Studies Program and Professor of Economics. This is part of a series in the class in Industry Strategy and Policy. Those of you that are in the class know this, where we're really trying to make an effort to connect theory and practice, to do as many applications as we can. How do we connect the textbook with real-world applications? And tonight's session deals with the broadcasting business. And I think I personally kind of have three goals for tonight, which was to get some historical perspective on the broadcasting sector. And the second is, what are some of the forces driving changes in that important sector of the global economy? Market forces, technological change, political forces, demographic changes, culture, globalization. What are the factors driving change in that industry? And maybe most importantly is, what lies ahead? Where is this business headed in the next 5 to 10 years? Tonight we have two members of the Lafayette community. I was going to say guests, but they really are part of the community that are here to talk to us about this industry, and combined they have many years of experience in the broadcasting business, and in particular one of the world's great media enterprises, ABC, which of course is now owned by the Disney Corporation. When we first started talking about this about a year ago, we talked to Susan about this, Susan Fox, and she said, I feel like Bruce Maggin and I have gotten to know him. I feel like we're living parallel lives a generation apart. And I thought, isn't that beautiful? It's an incredible opportunity. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice that you as the next generation would sort of continue this tradition in this really interesting sector of the global economy? And in some ways they are, in many ways they're running parallel lives. Susan, they're both alumni of the college. Once they left, Susan had her degree in engineering. She went to law school at the University of Virginia Law School. And Bruce, when he finished at Lafayette College, he goes to law school. He goes at Cornell University. He got an MBA, and Susan, you have to go back and get your MBA now to keep the parallel lives, keeping moving ahead. And then Bruce, right after he graduated, he got his law degree. I think it was his first job. He went to a fledgling startup broadcasting company, ABC. And in those days, I want to say, once upon a time, there were two bears. ABC Bear, CBS, Papa Bear, and NBC. There were only two major networks at that time, television networks. And Bruce went to ABC when it was just beginning in the television broadcasting business. He started his career in the corporate planning department. I've joked that I think he was the corporate planning department of ABC at that time. And Bruce is an incredibly modest person, but I've really asked him to go into the unbelievable creativity and the innovations that he was behind during those times, early days of ABC, and things that had come on, and you all know those names now. But Bruce was behind the startup of those, so I hope I've really asked him to get into that. Susan, after law school, went to work. She was a clerk at the U.S. Court of Appeals in the D.C. Federal Circuit. She went to work for one of the powerhouse Washington law firms, Hogan and Hartson, and then did a tour at the Federal Communications Commission. So she was in government, public sector. So Bruce, you need to go through the public sector now.
Government needs you.
Keep this parallel going. And now Susan is Vice President for Government Relations at the Walt Disney Company, which we know is one of the world's most famous brands. And Susan is one of the most respected lobbyists in Washington. Her duties include she represents Disney's interests on, as you might imagine, among other things, ABC. So we're getting some new traffic. That's the deal.
Yeah, the email said the wrong, but then your email is correct. So.
As long as it wasn't my mistake, I didn't make the wrong mistake. I'm okay. Come on in. Come on in. Thanks for coming.
I just can't sit in this. Okay, that's fine. I'll take this.
We're going to pause for a station identification or for a commercial break.
Come on down, you get
Come on
stuck
down.
in front.
Come on down.
You can move mine now. Which one?
Sorry about
Let
the
me move mine.
confusion.
Let me move mine.
Their parallel lives don't
Okay.
quite end even with that, and they now are both members of the Lafayette College Board of Trustees, and I'm so pleased they're back with us tonight, and let's please welcome Bruce Maggin.
Well, the first thing I want to say is I want to honor Dr. Crane because he has been so persistent about getting Susan and myself together to talk to you about the broadcasting business and generally the media business. Disney and ABC are one, but they were not always one. In fact, shortly after Disney bought ABC, I disappeared from the scene. And I was fortunate enough to take the money that Susan gave me and invested it around the world, wound up owning the third largest television network in Russia, which is worth a lot of money. And then now I'm very heavily involved in Eastern and Central Europe. We're the dominant broadcaster in Slovenia, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia. Anybody from those territories? Okay, thank God. They won't criticize our programming. Also here today is the former chairman of the Lafayette College Board of Trustees, a media banker par excellence, former vice chair of Bank of New York, who our paths crossed as well. And we should mention that Alan Griffith is here and financed virtually everybody in the media space. So let me, what I'd like to do is leave you with my impression of broadcasting, of the broadcasting business, and really the media business, and what is it really all about. I was under the assumption that you had read a book called Television is the New Television, which basically talks about the delivery side of the business, how people consume video. But it's almost like Susan and I had two tin cans with a wire in between. That, if there's nothing on one end, there's nothing on the other end. So when you think of the media business, you have to understand that it is really, in its simplest form, three really separate businesses. The first is the production or creative energies that go into the production of content. Content is the food for the whole media business. There's a euphemistically called distribution side of the business. That's where the rights to that content are funneled and determined. And then you have the delivery side. There are three really separate entities in a lot of regard, especially today. In the old days, and the ABC television network would produce a program, would have the distribution rights, and they'd be very, it'd go on the ABC television network, and, that would be it. And then the government foreclosed us from owning our own programming, so we had to have a distribution outlet for either our programming or bought other people's programming. We couldn't be in the distribution and production business. Today, those rules are gone. But the content side of the business, I think, is best understood by understanding that studios produce content and then they have to figure out what to do with it. Today, there's so many different outlets for that content, we owned a film called Wilde. It's the life of Oscar Wilde. It was produced by us. We didn't have the expertise to distribute the film, determine where it went, so we sold off the distribution rights. The most profitable part of the business, by the way, is the distribution side. And that, we sold it to Fox Searchlight, and they took our programming, Wilde, and put it on a theatrical run in theaters. It then went on to network television, went on to video on demand, pay television, whether it was HBO or Showtime, and then went into syndication. Eventually was on a streaming platform like Netflix. And so all these platforms generated profitability for that content. And then they did it everywhere else in the world. Initially, about 15 years ago, all the television stations internationally, most of them, were government controlled. It was only about 15 years ago that private enterprise started to take effect throughout the rest of the world. All of a sudden, an enormous market for American content occurred. And all those things that had been created that was sat in libraries for years had a new life. This whole process was described in an outstanding article about a dozen years ago, I would think, called The Long Tail. And the long tail described how this stuff that had been produced and was sitting in libraries and never used by anybody, all of a sudden had a new life because there were new outlets for it. And it was a very prescient article and subject. And today, what you have is content. I mean, if you have cable or Netflix, you can get Alfred Hitchcock, I Spy, you name it, anything from the 50s, you can access. It was not like that 15 years ago. There was no further market for it. So the content side is best described by this article, The Long Tail, which is all about librarial product. The distribution side is best understood by this example of Wilde. And then the distribution side, which everybody understands, is changing right in front of our face. It's changing because 45% of all video consumption is now streamed. 45%. 45% of people have reduced their cable packages. 8% have cut their cord to their pay TV supplier. There's a magnitude of content that's coming online. There's I think I heard the number 400 produced scripted television shows this year. 400 scripted television shows. Twice as many as there were 5 years ago, because there's more outlets, there's more demand for product, and worldwide. So the world is changing, but at the end of the day, it still boils down to the production of content, the distribution of rights to that content, and then the outlets for that content. It's a tripartite situation, and by the way, it affects all media, whether it's motion pictures, radio, book publishing, it's all the same parameters, 3 different segments of the business. So I would say that instead of television is the new television, I would use the quote, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And just to put a fine point on that, I brought a press release, actually 2 press releases. So in 1994, the American Broadcasting Company announced a deal with America Online that I negotiated, gave them access to our news and sports, and something called the Fashion Channel, Fairchild. We owned Women's Wear Daily, and that was part of this. And I said, I was quoted in here, America Online is an excellent partner for us. That's basically the bottom line. Okay. This was April of 2015, so 10 years later. The headline is Fox Sports strikes a digital deal with AOL. Okay, so this is 20 years later. There's a quote in here. The quote is, Fox Sports has forged many partnerships with online media. The quote was from my son, Ben Maggin, who works for Fox Sports. Identical quote. His quote could have been lifted, or my quote could have been lifted and put into his press release. I mean, and the more things change, the more things stay the same. So that, what we thought we'd do, by the way, is hopefully you have some questions for us. We could regale you with stories about anything you want, from ESPN to Croatian television. So
Great.
what do you have on your minds? By the way, who knows who PewDiePie is?
Everybody does.
Oh, wait a minute. No, PewDiePie? Anybody? One?
No, come on,
Two?
seriously.
That's it? Two people? Do you know? No? PewDiePie? PewDiePie is the hottest online personality. Does video games, streams, it's basically a stream of consciousness for video games today. He plays video games and comments on everything that he's doing. He made $20 million last year doing this.
He works for Maker.
Maker, which
You know, you're
yeah,
on the same
that
place.
was another punchline.
Yeah.
Maker is owned by Disney, which is
Yeah.
a over-the-top streaming multi-channel network.
Yeah, so Maker, the next generation of studios is curating essentially YouTube content. And my actual 12-year-old, when he realized that PewDiePie worked for Walt Disney, ultimately thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. But because he's a little stronger in language than my 12-year-old's usual gaming streaming sites. But so the notion is, as it's not just any more traditional video studios, it could also be the type of content itself has evolved now into an online world that's much different, as you all know better than we do. No.
And he's Swedish, which also shows how global the world is. And he's the profitability is unbelievable. He's the number one viewed personality on streaming video. A friend of mine started a company called Machinima. Anybody, you probably know Machinima, right? Yeah, two of you, which is a service that basically services the video gamers with content. And PewDiePie was part of that, and then he left, and big controversy about that. But I mean, the profitability floored me, quite frankly.
Because it's not very expensive to stream from your living room.
No, it's not.
The
In your
snapping
underwear.
used to do. Yeah, and show, playing Minecraft. No, yeah.
Let me ask you, why does Walt Disney need a lobbyist?
So essentially, so you have some sense, particularly in this political season, when it's a little less so now, frankly, than even 4 years ago. But the notion of lobbyist has a sort of scarlet L associated with it. But every corporate entity who has any relationship with the government, which is any of us, because we all pay taxes, has lobbyists to some extent. Some industries are more regulated than others, so we sort of fall in the middle. So the Walt Disney Company, because ABC is one of the more regulated entities that Walt Disney owns. The movie studios are a little less so. The theme parks have a certain degree as well. But everybody needs some sort of sense when the government, they are going to propose some action either in Congress or at the FCC that could impact you. And it is a matter to some degree of the First Amendment. Everybody gets representation. We all get a degree of having to go before the government and argue our cases. There's been the case studies recently where companies, particularly Silicon Valley companies, and you'll see this now, who did not hire lobbyists. The biggest case study, for anyone who wants to start a lobbying shop in DC with a Silicon Valley shop, they start with the Microsoft case, which Microsoft didn't hire lobbyists. They were part of the Silicon Valley notion that we don't need to do that. We're not going to sully our reputation and hire lobbyists and go to Washington and play that game. And they got into an incredibly big mess with the government over antitrust issues. And since then, they have one of the biggest shops. Google now, although they will their lobbying expenditures have exploded. Their lobbying shop now dwarfs us. They probably have 25 to 50 lobbyists, whether or not they declare them all. There's different ways you define different people who do jobs for you. But Google as a company has taken on. You see it with a lot of the companies going into the quote-unquote unregulated entity areas, the Ubers of the world. Now, Uber has been very smart in New York, playing the PR game with regulation that the mayor there was trying to impose. But a lot of the businesses, Uber, Airbnb, who have gone into areas, they've gone in as the new entrant in an unregulated space. They have found themselves under attack from, and I shouldn't say under attack, which is subject to criticism by other businesses who do very similar business things that they do but are regulated. So all of those companies, Airbnb has staffed up in Washington because you have a notion where if it's almost a defensive play. A lot of what I do is defend the company against what I call bank shot lobbying. So Alan used to represent and fund cable companies. As you know, from wherever the markets you live in, at times there's a time when a TV station is off your cable system or off your, whatever your telco or video system is. What typically happens if there's a business, which I would call business-to-business dispute as to how much they want to pay for the content. Perfect. It's a business question. But what tends to happen is that one party will go to the government. In that case, there's a playbook where a cable company will go to Congress and say, you have to call the Walt Disney Company and tell them not to do X. Or you have to call whoever, my counterpart at Fox will face the same thing. You have to call them and tell them they've got to get back on the air or they've got to accept less money. And so it's this odd thing where you have companies trying to use the government to triangulate against you. So at times it's just pure defense.
Bruce, I think, weren't you on the board of ESPN for a while?
Yeah, I actually acquired it for the company, or part of the team that did.
So it was a startup and then ABC.
You have to be lucky in life. In ESPN's case, ESPN was started by a father and son in Connecticut who had this vision for a Connecticut State high school sports channel. Okay. They went around looking for financing. I'm sure Alan passed on it, but they found financing from Getty Oil. That makes a lot of sense, Getty Oil. Getty Oil actually was also in the macadamia nut business, which is more appropriate, I might add, being nuts. Anyway, they financed these two guys, and they originally started with programming like Australian rules football, and darts, snooker. They had no programming, and of course it was going nowhere. The executives at Getty came to us at ABC Sports and asked us to help them get better programming, and we assisted them in one of the classic heavyweight boxing matches of all time. It was called the Crown Affair, with Don King on one side, another guy on the other side. And we all partnered together, and we did the production. We actually delivered the rights. And we also got an option to acquire 5% of the company at a price. Well, Getty Oil was taken over by Texaco. The chairman of, actually, I'm not sure he wasn't chairman, but he was a board member of Texaco, was a guy named Tom Murphy. Tom Murphy owned a broadcasting company called Capital Cities Broadcasting, he was actually an ABC affiliate, very successful broadcaster, very smart man. And he had first dibs at acquiring the majority in ESPN. And he looked at it and he said, the Crown Affair lost a lot of money. They were looking at doing all sorts of deals that was going to cost a lot of money. ESPN was getting no money whatsoever from the cable companies. They were just spending money on programming, hoping that they'd make it up on advertising. He said, sports rights were going to be out of hand. I'm not touching this thing. Okay, so we then stepped up and bought bought the company from Getty Oil. Over the objections of some of us, our chairman decided to bring in Nabisco as a 20% partner. Nabisco had a sports television production business at the time. So they owned 20%, we owned 80%. That was 1984. In 1986, January of 86, Capital Cities Broadcasting and Tom Murphy bought ABC and said to us, I looked at ESPN. This is not a good business. So we presented a business plan. The first thing that we did was present our plan for how we were going to make ESPN profitable. With a jaundiced eye, skeptical, he let us continue. And everything that we said would happen, happened. We eventually, with the NFL football rights that we reached for, were able to extract a fee from the cable operators, which was the beginning of the end, actually, because now about something like $6 or $7 per month per subscriber is paid to ESPN for their content. But it was all really just lucky.
So I was going to ask Bruce a question. So I was going to set it up so that the question one of the big questions of the day is, to what extent, we talked a little bit this about beforehand, content companies should go directly to the consumer. So as you all know, HBO, you may or may not know, HBO, you could buy a subscription to HBO now without buying your cable package. That was, in the prior world, that was the crazy talk. So, because it's an add-on to a cable service that was a mandatory buy-through. CBS has a product now that you can offer. You buy straight. You can just buy CBS All Access for X bucks a month, and that's it. So, the question is sort of what does that mean for the world? And I was going to ask you what you think, whether you think that's the way content should move to flowing or continue through a model where the other model, the challenge with that is content going straight to the viewer versus content continuing to go through a distributor who then owns the viewer relationship.
This company in Europe that I'm involved with is primarily owned by Time Warner, which owns HBO. And we've had these arguments every time we meet. It's frankly, it never made much sense to me. HBO Go doesn't, or buying it separately, they actually require a subscription. CBS All Access doesn't, but walking away from that platform, it's very difficult for me to rationalize the long-term implications of that. There's a major, while you might think that the cable operators make a lot of money. They really don't make a lot of money on television. They make a lot on broadband, but they supply the cable to be able to get in your home and do the broadband side of it. But the functions that they do of aggregating subscribers, marketing, billing, and all that, is something that when you're a customer of theirs or getting paid by them, you really don't want to forego. Yeah. It's an important function that they provide, and they're not making a lot of money off of it. So I'm not exactly sure how it's going to work out in the long term. I would say this though: the one thing that's changed, the business really hasn't changed all that much. You're always looking for an outlet. What has changed is the incredible amount of data that's required to run businesses, these businesses in particular. There's a company that we had a relationship with called Park Center in London. They have 20,000 titles that they distribute worldwide. And I was talking to one of the people, and they were saying 20,000 titles, okay. They service 200 countries with 100 separate language tracks. And I forget how they multiplied it out, but it's in any particular year, there were 40 billion pieces of data generated by these 20,000 programs. I mean, somebody's got to do this big data thing. And to a large degree, I don't think our industry is capable of handling that on its own.
No, and that's actually the next point I was going to raise, is I think one thing that has evolved and we're dealing with now is data from TV. Traditionally, ratings were governed by sampling through these Nielsen numbers, which are, many would say, wildly arbitrary and based on one viewer, you know, in Des Moines, Iowa, can have a radical impact on a TV show. And now when you're looking at the companies that are coming up in the video space, the Netflix, Google, Amazons of the world, Netflix guards their viewership data with a vault. They will not disclose how much any of their shows are being watched to anyone, including a federal government that promises complete confidence. So that data to them is a treasure trove. We're dealing with and Google, and for the content companies who are making the content, ironically, have much less insight into the viewership than do the cable companies who have the direct relationship, or even now with a company like Google, where what they are saying they want to do is get into a sort of super TiVo-like service where they would accumulate all the content, offer that straight through to the viewer, but they would also at that point have access to a much greater degree of data about each of you than they already do. So it would be curated to whatever you have watched recently. So, and that is a competitive struggle, I think, for those within the industry who owns that. It's not just about the pipe. It's that data stream is incredibly valuable because Google, at the end of the day, sells advertising. And you may think it's a search company, but they sell advertising the same way we do, except we pay for the content and Google doesn't.
Netflix would be the #1 television network,
Yeah.
supposedly, according to NBC. Have a higher audience than NBC, CBS, or ABC, or Fox. That's how powerful Netflix is today. Netflix has entered our 6 European markets. In fact, they're going global effectively. I think they said they were going to enter 130 countries. But the one thing that they're missing is, and the one secret sauce that we have in our markets is we do all of our programming in local language. And nobody's going to be producing programming in Croatian, I guarantee you that.
Yeah.
But we do Big Brother, we do all the format shows, but it's all local language, and that I don't think you'd want to hear Vietnamese here, right? That could turn into programming as good as it might be in Vietnamese. You want it in English. They want it in their local language.
What sort of trends are you seeing in TV subscriptions, and how's that impacting certain channels you own like ESPN?
Well, clearly the pay TV business is undergoing, some difficulties. They're losing subscribers. There's a lot of competition with AT&T now owns DirecTV, and the telcos are battling with FiOS and everything. So the traditional cable guys are having their difficulty. You as consumers are cutting back on what you want. You know that you can get as much content as you want off of Netflix or Hulu or whatever. Some have Apple TV or Roku or whatever. There are alternatives today, which is, I think, very healthy for the industry. I'm not. They're going to have to figure out how to do a better job. A lot of the cable companies are trying to bundle in Netflix now as a way to offset that streaming phenomena. I don't know how successful it is.
Yeah, and some of the cable companies at this point are arguing that they would stop offering video altogether and just turn to broadband, and that would be their only stream. Now, I think that is more, generally, as you know from the various marketing messages you get, generally push video as a way to get you to subscribe to broadband. And also the broadband business long term, and if you wonder why net neutrality matters in a business context, Netflix is responsible for about 1/3 of the broadband traffic in the US. So if you think that Netflix is in its own, looking out for you, arguing that there should be strong net neutrality rules in the federal government, that's not the case. They're looking out for themselves. So, and that's why there are certainly there are public policy and sort of social dynamic issues around net neutrality, but there are also major corporate business investment decisions that are impacted by that, because if cable or if the broadband companies generally want to give up video and just become a big pipe, they want to be able to turn around and charge somebody to use that pipe, and the first person in the line they want to charge to use it is probably the guy who's using 1/3 of their distribution, which is Netflix.
Yeah, everybody understands what net neutrality is about.
Or has a theory?
I appreciate if you don't mind for students in my class, if you don't mind describing that.
Sure. So the general notion is pretty darn basic, that, and it evolved over the last 12 years, that a broadband company shouldn't be able to block an application or a website coming from a place it doesn't like. I've been in the middle of this for a long time, but it almost boils down to the same thing that Bruce started from the beginning. There's a historic struggle in our spaces between content and distribution. Now content is just broader. Content is apps, it's Netflix, it's Google, whatever it's called the edge providers, whoever's on the edge. There's the pipe and there's the edge. And the pipe folks, there became a question that the pipe folks were slowing down content coming from, whether it was a website they didn't like, or the anecdote that floated up was that a company that was offering traditional telephone service didn't really like the fact that services like Skype were using the broadband pipe to erode away your telephone service that you used to have in your house at home, that probably not that many of you have anymore. And so the government got involved in the question of whether that should be allowed or not. And through several iterations on a very high level, which was fairly nonpartisan, and this issue is very partisan now, so I'm trying to stay down the middle of the road. But on a very nonpartisan level, there was, I think, some agreement, and this came from a Republican administration at the time, that there should be a basic set of principles. You shouldn't allow blocking. And since that time, fast forward through 2 efforts of a Democratic administration, the question has become, what does that mean? How regulatory does the government get as we impose that overall standard? Currently, the rules are such that a broadband company certainly can't block anybody. There is a pretty strong set of rules in place. The most pressing question business-wise is whether those companies will be able to charge companies like Netflix. Generally, the rules look like the rules that's in place now say no. Those are all being subject to court review. The other set of issues that are bubbling up with all your devices, which I usually hold mine, whether you can get free data. Say that if AT&T, if some service offers you, like T-Mobile is doing this now, if T-Mobile offers you, if you watch ESPN on T-Mobile, it doesn't count against your data cap, whether that's lawful. And you could argue it both ways, pro-consumer, anti-consumer. There's actually, and this is your government at work, and there's actually a 7-factor test that will govern whether a lot of these new business offerings will be lawful or not. And I'm my own bias that any test that has 7 factors is naturally ambiguous. But there still remains a lot to be seen. And frankly, if there's a change in administration over the next 2 years to a Republican administration, I'd expect that whatever rules we have in place now would be repealed. And actually, I don't know if that would change what you get on your devices or the business at all.
The argument on this side is people have made an investment and they should be able to control their own investment. And it's been argued. I'm not sure that it will change. I think this is probably, I hope, settled myself from my perspective. But it's an American thing, frankly. Elsewhere, the rules are a lot different.
Just got a question. You kind of just alluded to what I was going to ask, but what is the issue of net neutrality
Is there a similar debate, or is this just only an American issue?
On
Net neutrality.
oh, net neutral. Every country is different. Every country is different. But we don't have we have not had, to this point, the kind of traffic that we've had here, where Netflix is such a dominant user of pipe. Our streaming businesses abroad have not been all that significant up to this point. What we've been trying to do, quite frankly, is provide a little more content to the distributors, meaning the telcos primarily, in those countries, giving them more content and letting them decide what to do with it. Let them repackage it. We've got our own television business. We have a fairly robust internet business, but we are trying to package services that will help the telcos get more subscribers, because their penetration rates are nowhere near what they are in the U.S. I mean, 90 some odd percent. So it's a little bit more different dynamic.
And it's interesting, my impression is, Bruce, you're more involved in Europe than I am, that this is an odd thing to say, but just respect to net neutrality, the EU and even Canada have been less regulatory than the U.S. Now, if on the other side, you could say, well, there's need for those regulations, you can argue it, but they have been. There is a lot of chatter internationally about what does internet freedom mean, sort of, and that can come around both ways at you, because when you're dealing with markets like China, they regulate the internet pretty strictly, but
And there are there's a lot of politics in China, for instance. We launched the first two foreign-owned children's networks in China, one terrestrial, one cable. The Panda Club and the Dragon Club. This goes
Makes good
way back.
sense.
And they welcomed us. They wanted us in. They would do anything for us, because, you know why? Because we weren't Disney.
yeah, that's probably true.
Disney had a very bad reputation in China, and it was, it's, the Shanghai Park that they're building basically was on hold for a long time until they settled the politics of it. These countries have dynamics that are a lot different than here. I mean, we have politics, but they don't get in the way of one. It's not one company against another generally.
Can I ask, and this is kind of a brand question, in the sense of the fit of ABC within the Disney brand. And Bruce, as I recall years ago, I think you left about that time, in a sense that you had a different view of the cultural mix between ABC and Disney.
Many people still do.
Oh, it was unbelievable.
So in some ways the synergies are there, but they were.
Well, I think Disney's, my perspective, is blessed by having Bob Iger. Bob Iger came from ABC. He was my boss. I reported to Bob. He brought a culture that was established by Tom Murphy and the Cap Cities guys, that was more collaborative, a lot more collaborative. I was shocked when Disney got involved with us. The elbows were incredible, unbelievable. It was hard to believe that people actually could function in a situation where the CEO had basically a Gestapo who would come into your business, which we all ran. We ran our businesses. They would come in and they would tell us, well, we don't like the way this is done or that's done, and the elbows were unbelievable. And it had nothing to do with the business. The business was would have functioned great under any circumstance. But it was a personal, they felt a need personally to insert themselves. Bob, the first thing he did when he took over as CEO of Disney was get rid of this strategic planning group, strat planning. And while it might have regrown a little bit, that was a major move, I think, that helped integrate the cultures. When
When did he go in?
he was chief operating officer from the get-go, when the company was bought the deal closed in January of '96. In like February or March, 70 of us came to Disney World in Orlando. It was probably 20 ABC people and 50 Disney people. And the first meeting, Michael Eisner, who was CEO of Disney at the time, was a former ABC guy. So he had an understanding of some of the dynamic. Anyway, we all sat in a square, the first meeting, and he turned to Bob Iger and he said, "Bob, would you explain to this group, to the Disney people, what ABC was all about?" It was one of the bravura performances I've ever seen. He was incredible. He spoke for probably 45 minutes, went unit by unit in detail, not just what it did, but the numbers and how it was functioning, what the plans were. He's an exceptional guy. He's got an incredible memory. And so the two cultures, I think, have now blended.
They have. I mean, but there's still tensions. I mean, I joke, and even within ABC, ABC News has always sort of held itself off.
Yep.
We're not like the rest of the company. We're news people. Like you people, especially lobbyists, you go do your own thing. We are news people. So there's still and you still build these brands. With Disney, and we have these conversations. Disney now owns Marvel, so Disney movies. Slightly different than a Marvel movie. The Marvel whole gestalt, is little, and you see this every time we buy something. There's this question, is it going to Disneyfy Marvel? And I think Marvel has shown that it's held its own within that. But it's hard. And Lucasfilms with Star Wars was the same thing. Is there's chatter is going to be Disneyfied, and there's a challenge to maintain a family of brands. But and there is a fundamental question too, and it's more relevant for you, is what do brands matter today? And the theory is that in a world of search, brands still very much matter as a search tool, but there may be fewer of them. It's like the cable channels, they will matter, but there may be a winnowing down. I don't know, Bruce, what your take is of that.
Yeah, I think that, the world can only support so much. And I think we've reached that point. And the cost of content is not inexpensive. Creating content is expensive. The way the world works, if you have a series that you launch, the studio that produces that series, Scandal or whatever it is, deficit finances that show. They'll probably get from the network, I don't know, it used to be 80% of the cost of each program. And when you're doing 22 or more episodes, that at multi-millions of dollars, you're financing, the studios are financing a lot of that business. That's what makes it not so profitable. Because if you're canceled after 1 year, and I had that experience because we produced a series that was canceled after 1 year, you eat that program. That thing has no value after that. There's no syndication market for a broken series like that. I was reading today, there was Unbelievable or some show that was canceled after the first season, and they renegotiated all of the talent agreements, cut it to the bone, and then CBS picked it back up for the second season.
Much cheaper.
And then it started to do pretty well. They had a third season, but then they were going to cancel it, and they got a deal with A&E or somebody like that to run the show at no cost, just to build up enough library programs to syndicate it to local stations or other cable networks. But the cost of producing content is expensive. So at some point, there's got to be a law of diminishing returns on that stuff.
And it is the case that even though viewer ratings for content have gone down, for, say, Modern Family on ABC compared to what we would have had years ago, the cost has gone up and continues to go up at a very high rate because of the competition for the eyeballs is that intense. And a lot of times the traditional media companies get asked, why don't you roll out your series like Netflix? Well, Netflix is rolling out one series at a time in a 20-episode run or a little more limited episode run. Whereas for ABC, if we were to, when we launch a new show, even if it's a Shonda Rhimes show, which we think will likely do pretty well, if it's costing a couple $1 million an episode to make, which basically everything does now, you're now multiplying that times 20, and that's the initial investment you make. So if you pull out your entire series without knowing if it's going to succeed or not, on a full schedule basis, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that you just have lost by doing that, as opposed to episode by episode seeing what's watched and what will succeed. And if you think that you know what will succeed, Bruce lived through these, I watch them now. Everything we put on air is tested in rooms like this. They test it, and it's really smart people just like you who know how to test shows, and they know how to write, and they're smart, and they make beautiful shows, and they test it, and they think it's going to do great, and they go out and they tell advertisers it's going to do great, and most of them fail. And then later they're like, well, we think it failed because of this. It's really hard to make shows that actually succeed.
So I have a great story. The world, probably the preeminent programmer of all time is a guy named Mike Dan. Mike Dan is 90 some odd years old. He's a good friend of mine because we shared a suite. He was on one side, I was on the other. Secretaries were in between. He was the guy at CBS that was the guru, the absolute guru. Working for Bill Paley, did I Love Lucy and all of you name the shows. He was the head programmer. So I have two stories about him. The first one was that he one day walked. He and Bill Paley were looking at some show, and he went up to Bill Paley's office, who was the CEO, founder and CEO of CBS. And he walks in, and Paley says, I really love this show. This is the best show. It's going to do this. We'll put it in this time slot, whatever. And Mike Dan said to him, Bill, it's unbelievable. You took the words right out of my mouth. In fact, here's, my memo that describes what, exactly what you said. And he left, and so he tells me, well, thank God I remembered which pocket the memo was in. Because he had one to reject it, one to... The other story was, so we're sharing this suite, and one day he runs into my office, and he says, you got to see this show. He puts a cassette in my machine, and I'm watching the show. I'm saying to myself, this is the biggest piece of garbage I ever saw. Who in his right mind is going to watch this thing? Horrible. I mean, just horrible. And it was an insult. But he knows what he's doing, right? You know what the show was? Roseanne. I mean, some of these guys have...
And yet, darn well.
Yeah. I was right, yeah, exactly.
It was horrible, yeah.
Can I say, it's hard to find villains these days. I guess business people are villains, and Russians and Nazis, but you've got to be really sensitive to who the villains are. And it's back to your screen testing or your market testing idea. How do you go to vetting that? How do you vet the possibility of offending someone? Because it seems to be...
So I'll tell you, it's hard. Sensibilities change, and I'll tell you, we have a show now, and part of it is just pushing the limits in different ways. This isn't a villain story, but we launched a show a year ago called Blackish, which takes a different take on an African-American family growing up in the suburbs. And it leans into a lot of issues in ways that, the first time I actually showed it to, I thought the pilot was great and really addressed a lot of questions that, are out there. And so I showed it to a bunch of folks who are friends of mine, and the reactions were so varied. One of my good friends says, oh, that's my life. Like, that's my life. And other people are like, oh, how can we show that? And you just don't know. Sometimes you have to lean into some of those questions in a way that's a little more challenging, but then you know, I see a fair number of the viewer email that comes in, and you know, there are legitimate concerns raised about the questions raised. But a lot of the shows that we talked about going back through time. Like Three's Company was, you know,
Yeah.
bizarrely controversial. As two women living with a guy. Like that was it. Like that's what, you know, you do when you graduate college now. But that was oddly controversial then. So in many ways, you know, that's sort of TV's job.
I have a question each, so can I just ask
Yep.
them both? First, I read somewhere that reality TV programming is cheap relative to some other types of shows. When you're deciding what type of show to produce, how do you do that trade-off between risk and cost and making the decision about how much you're going to spend on what type of programming? And Susan, Bruce mentioned Scandal, which I've been
Yeah.
watched over the weekend. So if you've seen it, there's that Texas oilman lobbyist, and I think that's a lot of how people see lobbyists, who sort of go in and bribe and cajole to get your way.
Yeah.
But you talked a little bit about the defensive role of interest groups or lobbyists. Could you also speak to the information role, which I think you implied when you were talking about net neutrality, the information that they provide?
Let me, on the reality side, first of all, it may be insulting, but a network is made up of television stations, local television stations. And the local television stations have value based on their affiliation with the network. I owned 6 television stations at one point. They all were network affiliates, and actually Alan knows this better than anybody. Those were financeable. We were always offered independent stations that had no network affiliation, but just didn't have they might be in the same markets, but didn't have the value. Today, what you notice at local television stations is that it's not, maybe not reality, but it is their news segments have increased from an hour to maybe 2.5 hours of local news. And primarily it's a cost containment option. They already have the studio, they already have the personalities, they have people out, and so they're trying to cut costs and eliminating syndicated programming. On the network side, reality shows are less expensive. I mean, we do The Voice, for instance, in the Czech Republic. It's a format, we pay a rights fee, and we have a studio and we load it up, and people, there's not a lot of cost to that. Also doesn't have a lot of replay. It doesn't have a second run or more. But generally, those decisions are cost related. Formats that work in the United States may or may not work elsewhere. Formats that work in the American Idol obviously was a British format that was brought here. So it's primarily a cost aspect. They're less expensive, and if they get an audience, generally they're already tested in other markets and they're brought here. So that's how it's determined. And there are going to be more reality shows, no question about it. Scripted shows are extremely expensive.
Mm-hmm. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of lobbying advocacy, and you mentioned Scandal, which is great TV, and everyone should watch it because it's on ABC. But
You can't stop, that's the problem.
right though, fair enough. And people ask me, what's the most realistic show about Washington? They think, oh, it's House of Cards, it's Scandal, it's Veep, hands down. Like the level of silliness and pettiness for any of you who watch it, that's a window into Washington. But I will say, so, and there's an element there, a lot of the people who run our country are very young and inexperienced. So I encourage you all to come to Washington. And I will say this, when we bring, it's standard MO, when we bring our folks to Washington and we do visits, and I do this last time, sometimes I help sometimes our affiliates will come into town, and I'll sort of help guide them through the process a little bit. One of the first things you tell them is if you walk in a room and there's a 24-year-old sitting there, and that person is meeting with you, you shake their hand and you sit down and you talk to them, because that person is probably the person making the decision. And even members, so there's members of Congress who do not come up they generally do not hearken from the businesses they regulate. And you often don't see many, notwithstanding the current presidential election, but media titans going to run the government. So they generally don't, and these men and some women run the commerce committees in Congress who regulate the media and sort of and telecommunications. And anytime one of them goes awry with a statement, you hear about it. And 10 years ago, maybe 12, then Senator Stevens, I think, called the internet a series of tubes. And that was, he was a very nice man, but that went around the internet quite a lot. Even on the regulatory side, you generally have people who are running regulatory agencies who may have given money to a campaign, who may hearken from businesses they regulate, although that's harder now because of the ethics rules, which are good and bad elements. You have people who may not know much about the business, and then they hire generally young people. When I was senior advisor to the FCC chairman in charge of media regulation, I was about 30-odd years old. And so that was my job. And looking back on it, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So, but there's a value to people coming in, to members of Congress who testify. What we get asked a lot from a media company is, why isn't there more competition why aren't you putting more shows on Netflix? Why isn't there more competition to cable? Why aren't you doing X, Y, and Z? Well, going in and explaining to them what we are doing. Going through, what all the expertise that's in Bruce's head. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're already doing. Here's the history of what happened when you regulated it this way. When there were rules to prohibit us from owning our own content, that didn't do any good either. So don't do, and providing advice based on that. A lot of the calls I get from committee staff on Capitol Hill will ask me, Susan, can you tell me what happened in, 2002 when this issue came up? So it's a lot of expertise that they will then take and use when they shape whatever proposals they're making. But there is a significant education and information component that goes into play, because the people who are running our government otherwise wouldn't have the information and would make, even the extent to which they're not making decisions today, would make poor decisions.
So, Michael, let me just, I'm just curious, how many people really would like to work in the media business? Do you have a strategy for it? Or how you're going to, what's your plan? Do you have a plan? Do you have a thought? Here's one of the things that I think I'd like, this is a good format because Michael Kaiser is sitting here. Michael is head of the communications department of Lafayette. One of the things I think we should think about is creating, and I get all the videos and everything but we should have our students aggregate, use Snapchat to create a daily news integrated, and ask some of these kids who want to be in the media business to help edit that for publications to our community. They'll get a great experience, we'll have a unique product, and I think everybody would benefit. So I'm putting it, now I'll answer your question.
There you go.
Once you do that, you can answer.
My question was going to be about Snapchat. I read a story in the Atlantic last fall. You guys probably know exactly who this is. Chinese multi-billionaire who's building bigger than Hollywood in China. This huge complex of content creation, essentially. And at the same time, he's also buying and building all kinds of theater chains, including here in the States. So when we were talking about net neutrality a little bit, I started thinking about, it seems to me like, maybe I'm wrong, but the boogeyman seems to be what we need to be watching for is that confluence between people who create the content and the only way for you to get it. For example, if Netflix had broadband, I'm hosed.
Right.
Because I'm going to pay him I'm going to be really squeezed. And I thought about this Chinese guy in this big enterprise, and he's buying all kinds of cinemas here in the States. So he's controlling content. He's also buying studios here. He bought Legendary not too long ago. He's buying studios to create content. He's luring Hollywood to China to make content in these studios, because apparently they are unbelievable. And he's owning the distribution chain through the cinema. Is that the boogeyman? Not that guy, but I mean, is that the practice we should be?
Traditionally, it is. I should say recently, there's a question in antitrust policy of whether the big worry is if you own everything horizontally, so if you own all the movie theaters in the world, or if you have vertical integration, which is you own a bunch of content and a bunch of movie theaters straight through. Traditionally, the old school antitrust scholars would tell you the worry was horizontal combination. That's changed in this world, and when Comcast bought NBC, the federal government went through a process of imposing significant conditions on that merger in an attempt to ensure that Comcast wouldn't favor NBC's content over say, ABC's content, because we're not owned by Comcast. I think...
And of course, they got sued by the Tennis Channel.
Yeah.
Because they owned the Golf Channel.
Right.
And didn't give them the...
That's exactly...
Yeah, sitting next to a lobbyist. So, there's not enough, Then Comcast tried to buy Time Warner
Yes.
Cable. I mean, it would be insane. Would have been insane to allow that kind of market power. As far as the studio business is concerned, I guarantee you, that's the worst business to be in the world. Physical production facilities, horrible. I don't know what it's like in China, quite frankly. Maybe it will work there, but we owned a huge studio in Romania that was used by the Tom Cruise and doing major feature films and local It was a disaster. I mean, you have to have all sorts of infrastructure to support a studio, physical studio. That is not a good business. The theater business, the theater business, ABC was, as I mentioned, was formed by United Paramount Theaters, which was spun off because the government said you can't own content distribution and exhibition. So they spun off the theater business. The theater business, it was the world's largest chain of motion picture theaters in the world. 300 American cities with 600 and some odd buildings, and outdoor, drive-in theaters. What happened was cities built up around the outdoor theaters and around the cinemas, and all of a sudden it became a real estate play. So in 1970-something, I had to go to the chairman of ABC, who was president of United Paramount Theaters, Leonard Goldenson, and tell him and present a plan to sell the theaters, which at that point were 1,700 screens, throughout the country in places like Richardson, Texas, and Asheville, North Carolina, you name it. We owned the Four Corners of the Loop in Chicago, the Four Corners of the Loop. And, with the Fox Theater, it must be a relative. And we sold that off for the real estate value, which was multiples of what it was as a theater business. Theater business is under pressure as well right now.
And I'll add, when Bruce mentioned the Comcast tried to buy Time Warner Cable, that was blocked. It was thought when that was announced that was going to go through, because they said it was just horizontal. They were just buying more broadband. And the government actually looking at broadband competition, and actually the worry was that broadband they were going to try to favor their traditional cable content over Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever was coming, so-called over the top. So, and there's another merger now, Charter, this conceivably smaller company is trying to buy Time Warner Cable now.
Can I ask I think a related question is about the production versus the distribution. And so ABC you have your own production facilities. But what kind of analysis goes into, you produce a series, how do you decide, do I sell this now directly to Netflix, or do I now put it out You
Yeah.
know, you're competing not against yourself, but up the chain, or is it down the chain?
Well,
I don't know.
Sometimes you sell to competitors.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
The days where you produced for your own, in fact, the thought that Eisner has was he was going to produce all the programming for ABC. It failed. I mean, you're not that good. You're just not that good. So it's important, to diversify your customer base. So Disney will produce for a variety of networks. There's no in-house programming as you might think.
And sometimes it does go back to the brand. So, for the question is, ABC buys Modern Family from Fox. So, for whatever reason, Fox obviously produced it. They had to take a look at it, usually take a first look.
Yeah.
But they didn't think it worked with their brand. And it is a lot of ABC shows come around at the end. You feel
Well,
kind of good.
And a lot of these pilots are financed by other people. So, some people think up the concept, they'll pitch the concept, the pilot will be financed, and then they'll place it with a Fox. So it's not as clean as you might think.
And even now, there's some shows that ABC will make that goes to Amazon Prime. Like we're making shows for Netflix. And it's a show that presumably, you look at, you say, the best economic model for this and the highest likelihood of success is going that way.
Is that, do you have people that are, what kind of analytics go into that? Is it people that they're just good at it?
People like Bruce.
experience, or are
Yeah, he
you
mo-
really trying to do some modeling? and some-
I will say this much, so no one, and if we had a crystal ball, no one knows what the world's going to look like in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Whether there will be what we view as traditional cable service today, whether that's DirecTV or Fios or Comcast, if we knew that, we could plan around it. That's what no one knows. No one knows if Netflix is going to reach a peak and stop, whether Netflix will realize, start charging more, that they're going to pay for all this content, they got to charge more for it. So this is a lot of the discussion I have with the government. They're like, well, why don't you do X? Like, do you think we have the answers? No. And no one, it's largely it'll be driven by the viewer.
The serious deals, though, are the Olympics, for instance. NBC is buying out 12 years or more, maybe even 16 years. They are making a commitment of huge amounts of money, anticipating that the world's going to be something. And a lot of times, it isn't. When the Russian, we boycotted the Russian Olympics, it was a disaster for the broadcasters, got killed, obviously. The world changes, and now we're looking, the people who committed to the Super Bowl and got $5 million a 30-second spot, $5 million for a 30-second spot in the Super Bowl, probably it's unlikely that they had that in their model. So they came out very well. They probably had a significantly lower number. But there's a thorough analysis on these major long-term commitments. Much of it today is dependent on getting paid for your content. ESPN has 12-year deals with the SEC, for instance, for football. Who knows? 10 years from now, who knows what's going to happen? It's a dynamic business, but it's a risky business too. But you get the rewards of it all. It reminds me of actually, and Alan probably might remember this. In 1981 or something, I'm working for. I had left ABC for a time and worked for a guy named Bill Ziff, who had a communications company. And in 1980, the prime rate was about 18%. Today, it's de minimis. It's not if it exists at all. But 18%, obviously, you had to make more of a return than 18%. So I'm at this company, Ziff, and 4 people walk into the office, and they owned a small cable company in Mississippi. small little operation. But they were actually from Philadelphia, and they somehow acquired the rights to provide exclusive cable service to Philadelphia, this little Mississippi group. Right? Well, they came in, 18% prime, we were going to finance a risky cable operation in Philadelphia from these four little guys that, it was Brian Roberts,
Wow.
his father, Aaron, and Julian
Yeah,
Brodsky,
Brodsky,
the people who started Comcast.
Yeah.
They came out very well.
I've often thought if I was Professor Crane and you wanted to talk about the industry a little bit, an assignment you could give, I would, just to give an overview of how things change and all, if you could get a copy, you give someone like a copy of the Forbes 400 from 1980 or 1975, do one like in 1990, and then do one now, and tell you, write something up, and that's the only direction you would get. And I think if you went back and you looked at it, you would see that the great wealth was made, the people who were in there, and the families that are in there, really originally was industrial, the large industrial complexes. But if you looked in 1990 or the late 80s, some of the names are still there that have always been there, the Rockefellers and Mellons and those kinds of people. You would really see it was the communications people, the John Mallones and Ralph Roberts and all those kinds of people. Of course, now it's switched over to technology. But there's really been a shift. But the broadcasting industry has been so influenced by economics and technology, but I would say technology now is just amazing the way it's all changed.
To that point, a lot of the people who are on that list came from absolutely nothing. They were pole climbers, stringing wire, taking the risk, straight out of college.
I dealt with it.
And they had a vision, and it proved to be true.
I would say, I could comment on it if you wanted. A lot more informed than I am, but I was with the Bank of New York, and we were one of the principal lenders to the communications industry. And there's only just a few, 3 or 4 banks that really were involved in the communications industry, the broadcasting industry. Cable was just starting out. And it was because the early broadcast companies, they didn't have a need for financing. So they were really just dealing with their local banks. And there were these regulations, Bruce and I were talking about it earlier, 7, 7, and 7. No matter who you were, a company or an individual, you could only own 7 AM, 7 FM, and 7 TV. And early on, the FMs were useless. People didn't know what the hell to do with them. And so you have all these, what we call group broadcasters, just scattered all around the country in different cities. Well, and they were basically all privately owned generally, and generally they came into their network affiliated stations that Bruce and Susan were talking about before. Basically, the Bill Paleys of the world and the Sonos of the world would come and ask them, would you be my CBS affiliate? Would you do this? It was a business risk. Well, why do we want to do this? Well, little did they know that they were being offered gold down the line. And so you had these companies, and they had good, solid cash flow, and they really didn't have many capital expenditures or big inventory costs, typical industrial companies. So they really built up their cash. And then it got to a point where the families that owned them, some insurance companies used to own all these companies in the Midwest because they got started because they would give weather. And this is the 40s and the 50s, and out to the farmers and people like Nationwide. That was kind of a service they had to their clients on their big 50,000 watt stations, which are the largest. And so but then the rules changed where the 7, 7, and 7 went, and cable was coming along, and the cable operators, which Bruce refers to, we dealt with them. And I, as a young banker and AVP or vice president or so in the bank, you would worry. And we made some of the very first cable television loans in the 50s and the 60s. I didn't start there in '64, so I'm old, but not that old. And these guys would be overdrawn. They would, their account would be overdrawn, and like after 30 who are these people you're dealing with? They're gonna be overdrawn, I gotta report. Well, you turn the clock forward now, and these people, there was like 10 or 15, they're billionaires, and they were pole climbers. You know, you think of people like John Malone, you read about, you know, there's some of the Redstone now, and Brandon, all those kind of fellows, they just made a fortune, and those are the kind of people you see in that Forbes magazine. But it's really evolved, but it's really changed so much, and so when my associates here were saying, you know, who the hell knows what it's going to look like 5 or 10 years from now, you really have no idea, and there will be winners and there'll be losers going forward.
So I was going to ask, taking on that, sort of what do you watch now? Sort of the thought that's still out there is that live programming and mostly sports still holds value. Do you all watch live sports still? Any live? Do you watch any though live, over the air, you know, broadcast in pattern? Do you ever watch Scandal when it airs Thursday night?
Yes?
Well, I was actually going to make a comment on this.
Yeah.
I don't have a TV here, so
That's-
what I watch is like the next day online on
Yeah.
like, the channel's websites. And recently I've been noticing that they've been asking for my cable company.
Yes, they
and
do.
I was just wondering.
So that's going back to the direct to consumer. So what ABC does, so the idea is that so years ago when broadcasters just went over the air, so ABC was just over the air, and the only revenue stream broadcasters had was advertising. And then cable companies started carrying the broadcasters, and the broadcasters said, wait, you have to pay us for this. So currently, the cable companies pay ABC to carry your local broadcast station, or they carry, if you're watching Comedy Central, if you're watching, say, ESPN, ABC, which I know. So here, the cable companies will pay Channel 6 in Philadelphia, which you get here, to be carried, and they'll pay ESPN. And right now, there's different models we could go. CBS, you could pay them a certain amount of money and get whatever you want coming out of the CBS station. ABC, thus far, what we've done is to say, well, you know what? Comcast is paying us money to be carried in Philadelphia. We're going to make a deal with you because you're paying us. We're going to give you a little more value for your consumer that will hopefully keep you paying your cable bill. If you'll get you'll get a lot more content from ABC, including you're able to stream Channel 6 out of Philadelphia on your iPad, on any device you want, if you pay your cable subscription as well. So it's an add-on. And so that's why they'll ask for, part of the struggle now, I will say, is how to make that user interface really easy, because it's a pain in the butt. Like, who knows their cable subscription number? I mean, your parents may have one, but even if you call your mom and dad, they're like, seriously, what's my customer ID number? So reducing the friction there is part of the challenge. The idea behind it is that if companies are able to do that, it'll make them feel better about keeping their cable subscription and not cutting the cord. Because if well, man, if I pay my cable bill and you know what, when I'm in New York, I can watch my home station or I can watch ESPN wherever I got, this is a pretty good benefit I get, then that's the notion behind it. But you will see for certain products, that's the idea, it's tied to the cable stream. Other stuff is offered independently, but for ESPN, to get the full boatload of all the stuff that's online, you do still have to maintain that subscription. So, and that's where CBS has gone direct to consumer. HBO Now, you can go also direct. It doesn't have as many subscribers as you might think it might. Yeah.
Going off that, I know apps like Periscope
Yes.
get around that issue by just live streaming.
Yes,
free.
that's a challenge.
Yeah, do you see that?
That will be a copyright issue. It's not one, particularly when you're periscoping, say, sports events. As you probably noticed, the NFL, every time you watch a game, has a pretty aggressive warning there. Yeah, and you know, I will say this much for copyright generally, and college audiences are generally not the most pro-copyright audience there is. So, but here's my mantra on that, is that someone is making money from what you're watching. So no matter where you're watching on YouTube, Google's making, somebody is making money. If you're watching someone is monetizing that content. And it may be some criminal dude in Russia, but someone is. If the person who's making money off your watching isn't someone who invested money in making that content, there's a disconnect. And long term, you know, you can say, oh, what will really hurt Hollywood, we'll do this. But long term, if that cycle is broken, it will impact the amount of content and the
Sure.
quality of content that's made.
You know, in the old days, the network would pay the local station to carry its content. That's why the network affiliation was so valuable. That has been turned on its head now
I hate this term.
because the stations and the network that's supporting it are actually having to pay the cable operator in a lot of cases. In fact, the most valuable stations obviously were in the major metropolitan areas. It's interesting that some of the smaller markets are more attractive to investors today because when you have only 2 stations in a market and you have 4 television networks looking at those stations, it becomes a supply and demand situation so that those 2 stations will not have to pay for an affiliation fee generally. So it's sort of, the dynamic has changed to a certain degree.
Could you recommend for those that are interested in the business, is there a trade, sort of a standard trade publication, or what's a thing or two that a student could begin to follow if they want to begin to understand the business?
Well, broadcast and cable is probably, they buy, you know, a variety. I get, actually, I think it's Newsday publishes a daily,
TV News Check.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
free.
yeah, it's free.
Yeah.
And
That's
Broadcasting still, that's what I used to read, but I'm older.
what's that?
Broadcasting and cable, it is still there. Oh,
It is,
That used to be
but
Variety.
that was the Bible, but it's,
Broadcasting and cable?
yeah, but I would recommend, because
TV News Check is free.
TV
and they
News
give
Check
you
is
some-
a free
Yeah.
email that you get daily, twice a day actually, and it has really, it summarizes as headlines of all the articles, and you can open them up, and to a large degree, you'll really understand the business based on that. You have to pick and choose what you want to, what you're interested in, because it, you know, yeah.
Just a question.
I was just wondering what effect, like Slingbox or something like that, where you could kind of get your local TV and not have to pay for, like, I have a Slingbox here, so I don't pay for Philly TV. I live in New Jersey, so I get that TV. How that would affect, you know, where you guys are standing.
It all impacts, and actually we had, so Slingbox is the product offered by Dish, and we had an ongoing dispute with them, and frankly, we settled that. I mean, this is part of the tension between, sort of going back to the sort of not breaking the cycle, so that was, the notion is, and there is, and it's very, you should be able to take your content with you. Now, what we did was when that first launched, we didn't have a commercial arrangement with Dish, the company was offering it. So as part of when our big deal with Dish came up, we rolled into a number of commercial issues and ended up striking an arrangement with them where we sort of called it a day, had a financial settlement, and you know, we might not be psyched about that in all situations, but we sort of reached an accommodation where, okay, we're getting some revenue here, we have a deal with the distributor, it's called a wash. So where the services that cause the most stress on the system, I would say, are the ones that are completely unlicensed. We talked about at dinner, this one called Aereo, that was taking stuff off of they were taking signals off the air pursuant to this little antenna, creating their own VOD service, of course charging the consumers for it, but not paying anything back to the guys who are making the content. Those type of offerings are, not surprising, the ones where there's no value coming back up the stream, the ones that cause the most stress.
One of the other issues in the business is advertising skipping.
Yeah, yeah.
Are you
Yeah.
involved with that at all?
So yes, and then this is a challenge now, as you'll see when you watch TV. The ads are placed at different times. They're a lot of times trying to help reduce the rate of ad skipping. One of the things that ABC has tried to do on some of our products, which may or may not be frustrating, but is that for some of the VOD offerings, if you have Fios and you do VOD, you can pause but you can't skip the commercial. So the notion is you still get it all for free, you still have access to it, but you can pause, you can go to the bathroom, whatever else you need to do, but you can't skip it. There are significant questions, and it is a balance between advertising. There's a viewer experience. I know with viewers, they don't like pop-ups during the shows themselves. You can't blame them there. And there have been even some lawsuits around ad skippings by other products that are outside the system. I think there's still a lot to be worked out in that space.
Yeah, the other thing you should be aware, which probably is fairly obvious, is obviously high-profile content demands high prices. The streaming business is sold really on a tonnage basis. I mean, it just doesn't command the same kind of cost per thousand CPM, whatever, cost. And so you have to balance, to a certain degree, the value of your content in the various from a profitability standpoint, depending on where you're going to place it.
I think Michael Goldman, the last word.
On behalf of the Industry Strategy Policy class, we just want to thank you both for taking the time to speak with us tonight and appreciation of this long gift for you guys.
Oh. Thank you. Wow.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. That's very nice. This was really fun. Thank you. Thank you very much.